I read a lot. I research a lot. I'm an intelligent person. I know it doesn't look like it at times the way I act, but this is a persona. Larry, specifically, when it comes to tactics, there was a lot of ambiguity between West and East during the Cold War because, well, let me give you an example. The Soviets might call a tank destroyer, but it might behave completely different. It didn't, but just for argument's sake. It might behave completely different in terms of tactical doctrine for them as it would be to us, to the point where we wouldn't even call it a tank destroyer. And yet, it's translated as tank destroyer. And this led to a lot of bad intelligence, bad analysis. It led to probably a lot of lost money. For that, I recommend this. It's a 3-book set. And it's a translation. It's abridged by William Green and W. Robert Reeves. And it's fascinating. Just look at this right here. I mean, you can think about how your NATO army that you're a part of understands peaceful coexistence. But the translation taken from Soviet texts, this is their interpretation of it. So you can imagine that people who did major translations like this, when it comes to nuclear arms summits at Reykjavik and things like this, these are the people that would accompany Reagan, hopefully. Mr. Reagan, we believe this is what they believe. And if Gorbachev is telling you different, well, maybe he's telling the truth, but remind him that their own doctrine says this, okay? For a broader picture on this, it's a quick volume, and this was studied by people at Georgetown who would often, as analysts for the CIA, and I was recommended this. It's called Soviet Military Policy, and this is specifically in the changing era of the Gorbachev era. And it's an international security reader. I don't know if you can even find this any longer, but it's very, very fascinating. Especially, it's dealing with how the Soviets were feeling in terms of arms reduction and during the Reagan era, leading all the way up. It was an analysis. We were trying to figure out, are they really telling the truth? For example, it says from David Holloway at Stanford at the time, quote, excellent, important contributions to our understanding of Soviet policy will be very widely used in university teaching. William Zimmerman of University of Michigan writes a fine and representative selection on Soviet security policy. Once again, we were trying to figure out, were the Soviets telling the truth? Were they really vulnerable? And we were starting to see, wow, the Soviet Empire is going to fall here. And it wasn't just about the money. It wasn't just about we can't outspend the Americans. There were real weaknesses in the Soviet system, and that touches on some doctrines as well, especially nuclear policy. For tactics, from the 70s to the 80s, I have a series here, okay? The Soviet View, the command and staff of the Soviet Army, Air Force, and in the Great Patriotic War, because this was so effective, okay? This is so effective in realizing what the Soviet generals were worried about and avoiding again happening. And Soviet military thought. These were, military army college books. Next one, Fundamentals of Tactical Command and Control. For tactically, this isn't so much how do we exploit this with tanks, it's what's the Soviets thinking on it. The next, the Officer's Handbook. Now this is not our interpretation of it. This is the direct translation of documents that were obtained. Civil defense, this is major, of course, for, nuclear affairs. And talks about offensive versus defensive, when we think the Soviets will strike, when they won't, what are their true reasons. Now, if you were in a war college in America and you were studying, a lot of these books, you'll clearly see there is great potential to go on the offense in terms of the nuclear attack or the conventional attack for the Soviet Union. And you can see why these in war colleges were so critical. But you would also notice how much sense Soviet doctrine made, and that they were truly on the defense. Now, we didn't know what's real and what's not. You can write all the books on the policy, but they're aiming nuclear weapons at you. We better double think this, Finally, the next bunch of this series is called The Offensive. Okay? The offensive is the full Soviet view. Let me read you what the table of contents is regarding the offensive. Basic trends in development of the offensive prior to the appearance of nuclear weapons. We're talking about conventional here. Chapter 2, the nature of offensive under conditions where nuclear weapons are employed. See, now we go nuclear. Chapter 3, combat missions and formations of troops. Okay, axis of the main attack, etc. Now, a lot of this data was deliberately misconstrued in the next book I want to show you. Okay? Deliberately misconstrued. Okay? In order to justify a Reagan buildup of weapons to Congress and the people who will pay the bills, i.e. me, the taxpayers. Okay? And it was a fear-based document, and it was highly, deviously inaccurate. But people at the time thought that the United States had to have these weapons. And I believe that it kept the peace. Détente kept the peace. Horribly at a great economic cost, but that's what's going to happen. Okay? I don't like that my government had to deliberately lie to its people in order to get itself justified for us to pay for it. But that's what government does. Chapter 4, employment of nuclear weapons and destruction of the enemy by fire. I'm not kidding, that's how it's phrased in Russian. Chapter 5, defeat and defending enemy and exploitation of success. We're looking at conventional and nuclear here. Chapter 6, the pursuit. The essence, character, and methods of pursuit. Chapter 7, forcing water barriers. Tactical features of a river. This is all conventional. Essence of methods of forcing water barriers, etc. Very conventional. And the next chapter, attack at night. So we have a good book explaining to young officers, young Soviet officers, what to expect out of command and why. And then we get down to the nitty-gritty at the end, in terms of even to the point of exploitation and river crossings. Now, Isby has another book, and I'll show you that in the next segment as well, that deals with this, but more on the tactical side if you are defending. Justifying you being able to jump into, not justifying, but you being, just flat out you being able to jump into that motor rifle regiment commander's mind, what he's been told to do. It's fascinating. Another book that is overlooked by everybody. Everybody looks at Suvorov's Spetsnaz book because it's really flashy. It's amazing. You get to see how nasty Soviet Spetsnaz really were. Before that, Suvorov is a famous defector. That's not his real name. He came over to the West, and he's a former GRU officer. And he came over to the West, and we kept him from being killed. It's this. Ancient book, found it in a used bookstore in 1989, I believe. It's Soviet military intelligence. And this is his coup de grace. Spetsnaz is important because he talks about how the KGB has its own Spetsnaz, and the GRU has its own Spetsnaz, and okay, these are factions, but that's in that book. He talks about it a little bit in here. But this is his coup de grace, because this is what he did. And it's all about how the Soviets, the KGB will tell you one thing, but it'll affect you more politically. In terms of the military, if you're the paratrooper commander, if you're the armored regiment leader, you want to know how the military gets this intelligence and how KGB intelligence will be manipulated, and it's designed for the masses, and it's designed to cause an effect. It's designed to get long-term ploys, long-term get the people behind you or get the Westerners against their government, things like that. But with the KGB, since it's political, it's not bread and butter, cut and dry, ammunition in the barrel, usable, because you can't trust it. It's not usable 100% in the military. The military wants to know, what are my enemies? How are they going to think? This is why in the West we were studying the East. They want to know, how are they going to react? What will they do? What are their capabilities? And this goes into this Soviet military intelligence and how the GRU system works. From the guys out there in the BRDM-2s and the scouts, all the way to the higher up, fleet intelligence, GRU versus the KGB. There's one chapter that says, but why is nothing known about it? He really dives into the fact that the KGB outshadowed the GRU, and it probably shouldn't have at times, especially in times of war. So one more segment coming up.